I'm Michael Bungay-Stania. This is Change Signal. This is the podcast where we cut through the blather and the BS and the noise to find the good stuff that works in change. If you're a transformational leader and you are seeking modern change mastery, this is the party you've been waiting to be invited to. So welcome. I've often said that the definition of an adult-to-adult relationship is being able to ask for what you want, knowing that the answer might be no, and being willing to negotiate the difference. In theory, easy. In practice, almost impossible at times. But get good at this, and you unlock the power of influence. And that's everything when you're leading change. Because it doesn't take long to realize you have a disconcerting lack of control on things. But muscle up on influence, and you significantly increase your chances of success. Now, I'm guessing you want that. So, why not talk to a deep authority on influence? And this isn't the usual clickbait article on the topic.
When I sort of explain that I'm an expert in social influence, people think that that means that I have a bunch of tips and tricks for how to get influence. Because one of the first things we get wrong is that we think we need all that stuff.
Right.
Like we think we need bells and whistles to get people to listen to us.
Vanessa Bohns, professor and chair of organizational behavior at Cornell University and author of You Have More Influence Than You Think. Welcome to the conversation.
Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be talking to you. So how do you define influence? I suspect it's one of those words that we all think we know what it might mean, but you probably have a more subtle, nuanced way of talking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that is a big sort of difference here too in the way that we tend to think of influence and how I think of it and how the field thinks of it. So I think the sort of lay theory of influence is you ask someone to do something, they do it in front of your face, right? Or you try to convince someone of something and they say, you know what, you have a point, you've changed my mind.
Got it.
And of course, that hardly ever happens in that way. And so we think that we don't have influence because we don't see those specific things happening. In fact, influence is often change. It could be a change in how someone feels. It could be a change in how someone thinks or their behavior. But it doesn't have to happen right there. It can be delayed. In fact, it often is delayed. It's often cumulative. So it could be that we say something and then someone else says something a week later, and now that person's behavior has changed, but we still played a part in that.
Yeah.
And it can even be a change that is essentially a solidification, like solidifying something someone's already doing, right? So it could be that they were doing something, we confirmed that we think that's the right thing to do, and now they're going to keep doing that thing. So it doesn't have to be like a reversal. And in that case, it would look like we didn't have influence when, in fact, we did impact that person's behavior and feelings about their behavior.
So the good news is, just by being human and being alive, you're working influence. But if you're looking to understand that this is a power within your group, I mean, if I'm a change leader, what guidance would you give me on even deciding who I should be trying to influence in a perhaps more thoughtful, more mindful way?
Okay, so one thing that I think makes a big difference when you're actually trying to sort of use this great influence you have is actually being present around other people. And so this is something that, of course, has been coming up a lot in a lot of the questions about, return to the office and the effectiveness of like persuasion over virtual communication versus in person. And so the first thing is that we have a lot more influence over the people we are physically present with. And that's just
that's so interesting.
A fact of life is that we pay
biology, I guess.
Attention. Yeah. Exactly. And so that makes a big difference. So we're going to listen to someone who's physically present with us in a very different way than someone who's trying to influence us over, online or even over Zoom or over, the phone.
So the being present to people, are there certain people you can identify who are more likely to be open to your influence?
I think we often have this idea that we want to influence and change the people who are kind of the furthest from us because that's going to feel really satisfying.
Right.
if they flip their opinion, I'm going to feel like I've changed it, right?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, where it's much more effective to shift someone. And if you shift someone on the margins, who's, these are essentially, in politics, we would talk about like swing voters, but this is true in all sorts of organizational contexts. People who are on the margins, shifting them can make a huge difference.
I'm stepping in here because I don't want you to rush on and not hear what Vanessa's saying. Who are your swing voters? Who's on the margins? Now, if you're intrigued by this question, you might also revisit the episode with Dan Pontefract, where he talks about his black ops approach to finding these very people.
And it can be a lot easier to do that because one factor in persuasion is how far what we're trying to get someone to do is from what they are sort of inclined to do.
Right.
And so if you try to get someone who is completely against something to flip, all your arguments, they're going to it's going to feel like a contrast to what they think is right. They're going to push them away and push them away. If you try to get someone who's a little closer to shift, they're going to sort of say, oh, that's kind of similar. They're going to assimilate your arguments to what they believe. That's kind of similar. Now I can kind of move a little bit.
I love that you brought up the swing voter because I have never thought of this as an analogy to what the work we're trying to do in organizations. In organizations, I have thought of this kind of bell curve between, the keeners on one end of the bell curve and the people who are utterly indifferent and resistant to whatever you're trying to pull off at the other end of the bell curve. So people in the middle who you're really trying to, who could go one way or the other that you're trying to nudge. But thinking of them as swing voters is a brilliant reframing of how you might identify who you might be trying to influence.
Another sort of way that you can play up this idea that, people are influenced by social connection. People are influenced because they want to have good relationships with other people, right? We often think that we're going to influence people by convincing them of all the reasons that they should do something.
Right.
And so we'll say like, okay, here, we should do this for X, Y, Z, here are all these benefits. I think you should do this. And in fact, there's research showing that it's much more effective to tell people what other people that they admire or other people who are similar to them are actually doing. So like the people who we want to emulate are doing this. And that's going to be much more effective than saying like, you should do this, you should do that.
Was it Cialdini who talked of something like that, which is like, you put something like on your electricity bill that all of your neighbors are spending less on electricity than you are, creates that sort of social pressure to conform.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So Bob Cialdini and several colleagues had this study where they tried to convince people to conserve energy in their homes. And they either told them, here's all the environmental reasons for doing this, right? They gave like a very sort of logical, persuasive argument. Or they said, this is what all your neighbors are doing.
Yeah.
And when you knew what your neighbors were doing, that was much more effective. And they call this descriptive norms. It describes what's happening as opposed to prescriptive norms, which is like, here's what you should do, or prescribing this particular behavior. And what they find, which is related to my work, right, is that we tend to underestimate the effectiveness of descriptive norms. We go for the prescriptive norm. We think that's how you get change. That's how you influence people, is you persuade them of something. When in fact, so often the most effective way is to tell them like, this is what everybody else is doing. Don't you want to be like everybody else like you?
I love that. So if you were coaching me on how to generate and create a really good descriptive norm, what does a good descriptive norm have and not have that makes it influential?
Well, I'll tell you the mistake most people make is that they use descriptive norms to say exactly the opposite of what they want people to do.
Right.
And I teach this to my students every year, and every year it's like their inclination is always to use descriptive norms in this way because we try to create an urgency. We try to say this is a real problem here, right? 90% of people are not doing this thing we want them to do. But what are people hearing when you say that? They're hearing, oh, wow, 90% of people do that. Why shouldn't I do that, right?
Exactly. I don't want to be a weird 10%er. I want to be part of the bigger group. Yeah.
That's right. So on college campuses, they use this around binge drinking quite a bit. They've had these new campaigns because the old campaigns were like, look at all this risky behavior that, undergraduates are engaging in on college campuses. And undergraduates were like, oh my gosh, everybody's drinking. And their perception, exactly.
I'm being left behind. Yeah.
Exactly. So their perception is like, this is what you're supposed to do in college. This is what people do in college. And so they changed the campaign. The more recent sort of binge drinking campaigns that they have on many college campuses will say, only, they'll give some statistic like only 1 in 5 students actually engage in binge drinking. So you're like, oh wow, that's not a common behavior.
Right.
And then they might add some reason why that's a good thing, why you shouldn't binge drink. But they're essentially aligning the descriptive norm, like this is what people do, with the prescriptive message. This is why you should do that. And
right.
The big mistake people make is often saying like, everyone's doing this, you shouldn't do it. But like all people hear is everyone's doing it.
Now, if you want to do what other transformational leaders are doing, I think you do, then stick around, because Vanessa and I are about to get into just why people are less likely to say no than you might think. For more about Vanessa Bohns and her work, go to her website, vanessabohns.com. Now that's B-O-H-N-S, Vanessa Bohns. You'll also find her on Instagram at profbohns, P-R-O-F-B-O-H-N-S. And of course, her book, I'm a fan of it, You Have More Influence Than You Think. All of this in the show notes as usual. One of the key pieces of your work, Vanessa, is just understanding that people are less likely to say no to your request than the story you've made up in your head, which is like people are probably their default answer is going to be no. Knowing that people are perhaps primed to say yes more often than I think, what makes for a good request that increases the opportunity and the chance of people saying yes to the request that I'm making?
So I'll just quickly expand on this.
Please.
The idea that people are more likely to say yes than we think. So at this point, I've been running studies on this since 2003. And so it's been over 20 years. We've had participants in our studies ask more than 15,000 people for things. And before they ask, they guess how many people will say yes. Then we actually measure how many people say yes. And we find again and again with all sorts of different requests that people are twice as likely to say yes as we think. And I would say after observing that and kind of playing around with situations where it does or doesn't work as well, what I find is that face-to-face is the most important thing. So if you ask over email, we actually get the opposite effect. People think email is going to be much more effective than it actually is. And they don't really see a big difference between asking face-to-face or over email. So they tend to think if someone's going to agree to a request, they're going to do it of their own volition. They're just going to make a calculation, a cost-benefit analysis, and like decide whether this is worth their time.
At some stage, people are going to realize that people are not rational.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So people aren't doing it for rational reasons. They're not making a cost-benefit analysis for the most part. If you imagine yourself on the other side, right? You're not like,
right.
Should I agree to this? So you're thinking, it's really hard to say no in this moment. And so when you ask someone in person, it's got this social dynamic, this more relational dynamic. So it's just, oh, someone needs my help or someone's asking me for something. My default, again, is to say yes. So I would say if there were sort of 3 main takeaways from my research on how to ask to get a yes. The first thing is to actually ask.
Yeah.
Because the first thing people do is convince themselves there's no point,
right.
that the person will easily say no, or, they feel awkward asking. So the first step is actually to do it. The second step is to ask directly, because that's another thing we do. We beat around the bush. We say, I could really use help with this, as opposed to saying, imagine someone comes up and says, I could really use some help with this.
Yeah.
Like you can easily avoid that question. But if they come up to you and say, will you help me do X? Now you're put on the spot. You have to actually give an answer. And that's where we find these effects. And so it's actually asking, and then essentially, again, actually asking, right? Not just asking like indirectly, and then doing it in person.
Not kind of giving the vibe, and hoping that they read it in the subtext, what you really want.
Exactly.
So, Vanessa, I've heard of something called buyer's remorse. You've said yes, and then like 2 days later, you're like, oh man, why did I spend all that money on this thing that I don't particularly want? Is there such a thing as the remorse that people get from saying yes to your direct, clear, in-person request? And how do you manage the kind of the follow-on resistance that might show up?
Yeah, so this is a great question. And it's actually what I spend a lot of time thinking about, because we're so focused on getting that yes often that we don't think about the fact that sometimes that yes can come begrudgingly.
Right.
We can essentially be almost coercing people into agreeing to things they don't really want to do.
Right.
And that's not great for anyone, right? It's not great for the other person, but it's also not great for us. And so for me, I like to think about the request that gets people to most seriously consider what you're asking. And so that's actually asking. I don't think you should stop asking, right? Actually asking directly so they know that you are asking them a question, asking face to face.
So to step in here, look, one way I spur myself on to be brave and to make the request is to tell myself, stop negotiating against myself. That's when you got an initial request, an initial ask in your head, and then for some reason you respond as the other person to the ask, or at least how you imagine they'll respond. So, you reduce your ask, you make it a bit smaller, and then you ask again, and then the other person pushes back again. And in the end, you make this really watered down, wimpy request. So be brave, but don't just be brave. And Vanessa has this helpful guidance.
Then I also like to add some caveats where I try to give the other person a way to say no to me, because it's really hard to say no.
Mm-hmm.
And I really only want that genuine yes. So I do my best to sort of make my pitch, but then I also say, take your time and get back to me, tomorrow in a couple of days, because one of the things that makes it really hard to say no to someone's request is if you're put on the spot and you have to answer right then and there.
Right.
And we have some research also showing that, we often try to phrase requests to give people an out. We say you can totally say no.
Yeah.
But that's not very helpful because people know they can say no. It's just hard to do it, right? It's hard to find the words to say no.
Got it.
And so when we compare that, which doesn't really help people say no, to another version where we have people say, here are essentially the words to say no. So we say, would you be willing to do X? If you're too busy, just tell me, I've got these other things going on.
Yeah.
It could be something as simple as that, but you're basically just giving them the words that you will accept to be able to say no.
Right.
And what we find is that it doesn't actually make people say no more, but it does make people feel like that no is an actual option.
Got it.
Which ultimately gets more buy-in.
Look, I just want to sum this up and underline it. Give them the language to say no when you make a request. I mean, it's counterintuitive, but it also makes it more likely that they'll give you a genuine yes. I mean, one of the reasons people are anxious about saying no is FOMO. Another reason is just power and the way power works in organizations. And I'm sure people listening to this, partly what they're thinking around is, this all sounds great. If I've got the upper hand, if I've got more positional power or status or authority one way or another. I mean, how do you navigate the fact that you might be trying to influence people or being influenced by people who have different levels of power, control, authority than you have? Does that change tactics or influence at all?
Yeah, I think so. I'll get to that in a second. I also want to go back. You asked earlier sort of who to look for to influence.
Yeah.
And this is making me think of another sort of category of people, because we often think that the people we have most influence over are the people in lower power positions. And in fact, the research shows that we have a lot of influence. We have more influence than we think over people who are in higher power positions.
I love this. Yeah.
Yeah. Specifically, in one study, they actually looked at age as a sort of reflection of people's rank and experience.
Right.
And they asked people, if you were to give someone advice, would you rather give someone older and wiser, essentially, than you, or someone younger and more naive than you advice? And do you think those people would be receptive to your advice? And so, of course, people say the younger people who have less experience are going to want my advice. But in fact, both groups were happy to have advice. And we forget that we have a lot of experience, even when we're on sort of a lower sort of rank than other people. We have deep expertise in the things that we're working on that people who are above us really need to know. right? And
Yeah.
we have a lot of the information that they don't have, the details they don't have, the day-to-day interactions that they don't have access to.
Mm-hmm.
And they're really counting on us to give them that concrete information. Like they need advice from us. They need to hear what we have to say. And so they actually want that, but we underestimate how much that helps them. And so that's part of it.
That's really helpful. And, it's my lived experience because I've now, to my surprise, found myself on the on the older, more senior side of things. That saying inside every old person is a young person going, what the hell just happened? Well, I'm like, oh, now I'm the person who's trying to encourage people who are positionally more junior to me to go, look, give me your thoughts, give me your guidance, give me your opinion on this, because I'm actually, I'm kind of hungry to hear that. So that's really helpful.
Exactly. And so I think, when we talk about power, we're really talking about people's ability to control other people's outcomes.
Right.
And so someone who has power over you technically, yes, can affect, potentially your financial outcomes, potentially your career outcomes. And so those are the things we think about.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't think so much about influence and respect and all the things that someone in a lower power position can actually have.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we try to sort of, if, someone in a high power position is trying to influence us one way, but we on the ground see that that's not going to work, right? We have this informational influence that we can use to talk to them. And it's just, the big thing is to sort of understand where they're coming from. And this is a big thing about power dynamics is when you're in a lower power position, it's kind of more important to understand the perspective of a high power person to understand, this is their overarching strategic goal.
Look, I want to put on my facilitator hat for you and to give you a tool. So I use a 2x2 matrix to map this out, and I call it the I care, they care matrix. The horizontal axis is I care, and it's low and it's high. And the vertical axis is they care, and it's, again, low and high. So now you map out what you're actually thinking about, what you actually are concerned about. And when the they is your boss's boss, it's interesting what gets revealed. Often what gets revealed is how little you know about what your boss really cares about or your boss's boss really cares about. So this is an easy way to accelerate your strategic perspective. And that sets you up for this recommendation from Vanessa.
And then to try to talk to them on that level. I understand this is what you're trying to accomplish. This path isn't necessarily going to accomplish that. I still want to help you reach that goal. I think this is a better way to do it. And so kind of using that kind of language.
Yeah, again, really helpful. You've talked about just a key component of influence, and it's so simple. I love it, which is like be present, like in person, make a direct request, make it clearer, easier to say yes, also easier to say no.
Exactly.
I'm wondering, to what extent is your influence just built around your reputation and your brand and the kind of the relentless, endless micro actions that happen every day that kind of like a pointillist painting start kind of helping create the image of you that people have? Is that actually something to worry about, or does it really come down to just like get yourself in the same room as that person who you're trying to influence?
I definitely think reputation can be a big sort of factor in who we listen to. But I think reputation doesn't have to be this kind of branding. I think people take that a little too far where they try to, make their brand and they try to be the person who always speaks a certain way or, presents themselves in a certain way. Whereas reputation can be built in a much more quiet, sort of authentic way where you just become a person who people know is going to speak their mind, or you're the person who's going to consider all the things carefully. And you also, people definitely start to get to know people's issues, right?
Yeah.
We'll have meetings where it's like, I know that this person in this meeting is going to bring this up because I know that they always care about this thing.
Yeah.
But one thing that's really interesting about that is that being present in a meeting, in a discussion, even if you don't say anything, this is the thing. Once you have that reputation, people know like this person cares about this issue. Once you have that reputation, you're in a meeting, you don't have to say a word. And people are going to start addressing that issue because you're there and because they know that you're there and because they do know that that's your issue. And so building that reputation can actually give you this influence that if you then back off on trying so hard, could just kind of be part of the conversation just because you're there.
Are there any particular alleged influence tactics or hacks that particularly make you shake your head in despair?
Okay, this is my pet peeve, is people who say no is a complete sentence.
Right.
It is literally my pet peeve, and people say it all the time. But what I always say is yes is a complete sentence. Someone asks you to do something, you say yes, sure. You don't have to explain why you're agreeing. No one expects you to explain why. You don't feel the need to explain why.
Yeah.
But when you say no, I don't know anyone who's comfortable just, being asked for a favor, being asked to do something by your boss and just saying, no, nobody. We worry so much that no, it's so simple. People try to make it so simple, but it's so complex. We worry that it's saying something about us that we're not helpful. We worry that it's saying something about the other person, that they shouldn't be asking for something. We worry that it's going to damage the relationship. And so we have to address all those things. And so that's why I try to come up with ways that people can get better at saying no.
Well, I love that. I mean, no is a complete sentence technically, but it's also a relationship shortening sentence almost every time if that's your answer to a moment of connection and request.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great way to put it.
I pushed Vanessa a bit on her pet peeves, and we ended up in this conversation about the relationship between the big things and the little things.
For me, it's this idea that it's the industry built around it that says what you're doing already isn't really doing anything, right? It's like you're not actually influencing people unless you do these number of things.
Got it.
When in fact, more often than not, I think we're influencing people in ways that we'd rather not, because we're not aware of what great influence we have. Where here's an example I like to use is a manager will talk up a policy and say, let's say it's about work-life balance. And they'll say, we want to make sure that people have time to themselves so they're not burning out. Make sure that you take time off when you need it. And then someone takes time off and they make a little, side comment about like, do you think that they're really, sick at home or whatever it might be?
Right.
And so that's a moment where like, you think that the message you were communicating was the message, right? That big persuasive message.
Right.
When in fact, that time when you were off, like checked out of persuading people, that probably had the biggest influence is the little comment you made on how people feel about whether it's okay to take time off.
Yeah.
And so what I worry about is those tips and tricks are really focused on the moment that you're trying to persuade and not the moments where you're just kind of being yourself and accidentally persuading people.
Yeah. I referenced earlier this idea of a pointillist painting. And I do love that as a metaphor. These paintings made up of tiny dots of color. And when you step back, you see the whole picture. And it takes so few wrongly colored dots to ruin the picture. And it feels like you're saying something similar here, which is like, I'm going to torture this metaphor, but you're like, you got your portrait, that's your kind of main persuasive act, but it's actually all the color and all the painting, all the dots around it that actually make for it to being an influential moment. And you need to get all of those, the big bits and the little bits, consistent and therefore influential.
Yeah, I like that idea. And I think that is, I think consistency has been sort of a theme here, right? Because we have the prescriptive message that doesn't match the descriptive message, or the sort of big speech that we give, or the like official persuasive moment compared to our one-off comments that we make. And so it's kind of getting those things aligned, which you could call it authenticity, that like I'm keeping these things together, but I think consistency makes a little more sense.
Look, I know I'm old and grumpy, but I am not a fan of the whole influencer culture on socials, not least because their lives sound so pointless and relentlessly empty. I mean, there are so many people trapped in this kind of cycle of I need to be an influencer. But hey, it turns out we are all influencers all the time. Now, good news, you probably don't need to start a TikTok, but within your change work, make sure you're doing it well. And one way to influence the world for good, for sure, is by giving Change Signal some podcast love. So thank you in advance for your support. A review is always welcome. but so too is simply picking your favorite episode, sending it to a friend and saying, hey, you should listen to this. Apart from Michael begging at the end for help to get the podcast better known, it's actually pretty good. Thanks for doing the work. I'm really glad you're here.